Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to span the range of the first 15 verses of the third chapter in the first book of Kings. Herein we read of the dream where Elohim visits Solomon. King Solomon recently ascended to the throne and bestows upon him an unprecedented and unduplicated amount of wisdom. We can read of the parallel account in 2 Chronicles 1. I did one on that, but I actually typed it as 1 Chronicles 1. But that's the opening chapter of that book, and what occurs before the king's account is Solomon's power struggle. This wouldn't have been necessary from the chronicler's emphasis and perspective, because he sort of whitewashes all the ugly details that go into ruling. And so even though Solomon was the designated and David declared him to be a successor, it was not uncontested. There was factions which divided. Ultimately, I believe Nathan, the prophet, was instrumental in securing his ascendance, but Joab, David's most entrusted general, backed a rival claimant, and he was summarily executed by Solomon upon gaining power. And we also read of David's death in the 10th verse of the preceding chapter, and he also imparts him with final instructions not long then after. And then we see how Solomon kind of deals with this brother of his, this half-brother of his, who challenged him for the throne, and here really marks the beginning of the golden age. Solomon's reign can be considered as constituting what was the golden age of the United Monarchy of Israel. Its international prestige and commercial contacts were at their apex, and its international influence would never be quite again what it was during this time, and a lot of it has to do with the wisdom through which he ruled. So the opening verse reads, "And Solomon joined in marriage with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took the daughter of Pharaoh, and brought her to the city of David, until he had completed building his own house, and the house of Yahweh, and the wall all around Jerusalem." David had expanded or protected and secured Israel by protecting its borders, by fighting battles to secure its edges. So he bequeathed to Solomon a consolidated rule that was protected on its border, and Solomon is going to be a different kind of ruler. He's not going to be a warrior king. He's going to be a diplomat, and one of the ways through which diplomacy was sealed in the ancient world was by royal weddings. So this marriage to Pharaoh, his contemporary would have been in all likelihood Sihanoum, who ruled from the 21st dynasty. They were a weakened native Egyptian dynasty, generally believed to, or actually, in fact, belonging to the third interregnum period after the New Kingdom, where its height of influence and its apex and worldly power advanced. But the city of David would have been the southern extremity of Jerusalem. This would have been the original part of the Jebusite stronghold. These were the indigenous inhabitants before David expelled them out and wrested control of the city. And his own house would have been his palace, and the house of Yahweh would have been the temple. But as he builded northward from the city of David, then he eventually built a palace for his queen. Only the people sacrificed at the high places, for a house for the name of Yahweh had not been built until those days. So in the absence of a temple, people were sacrificing at various locations. Sacrificial ceremonies were a local operation, and there wasn't a central location. The temple would soon displace that. And the Canaanites, the indigenous inhabitants, they built high altars all across the land that was once theirs, filled with their idolatrous edifices, and he wanted something better and different for his people, Yahweh, that is. And Solomon loved Yahweh, walking in the laws of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burnt incense at the high places. So even though he's otherwise righteous and walking in the ways of his father David, a man after God's own heart, he did sacrifice at the local. There's no inference that his sacrifices were idolatrous at this point. They were to pagan polytheistic deities, as we read he would succumb to in the 11th chapter, which marks his demise and ultimately his death, and then the subsequent splinter of his united kingdom. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. Gibeon would have been located 6 miles to the northwest of Jerusalem, and it would have been the site and center of the tabernacle, which was the temple's predecessor, as the center of the divine presence, dwelling presence on earth for the nation of Israel. And the Ark of the Covenant had been moved to David's tent in the city of Jerusalem itself. So, but Gibeon would have been the religious capital for all intents and purpose at this moment of time. That would be until the building of the temple, of which we really begin reading of in the 5th or 6th chapter. Now here marks the 5th verse begins the theophany, which is the theological term for a divine manifestation to humanity. At Gibeon, Yahweh appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and Elohim said, "Ask what I should give you." So what's significant here is that this request, this blank slate for anything he wants to, comes in response to obedience. So Yahweh was not just giving this a blank check to any ordinary person. He was giving it to an obedient individual who walked in his ways. He loved him. He was loyal. He was committed to his ways, and he had the right spirit in him. So this was not an arbitrary. Now, if any of us were given whatever we wanted, we would probably respond quite different than Solomon if we were in his position or even in our own. And Solomon said, "You have shown great kindness to your servant David, my father, as he walked before you in truth and in righteousness and in uprightness of your heart with you. And you have kept him for him this great kindness, and gave him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day." So he's prefacing it with the due deference of all that he has given him. He gave him his father David, who ruled in equity in Jerusalem and the United Kingdom of Israel. He was a man after God's own heart, and he was kept and preserved, and the succession was not exactly smooth from father to son, but it was at this point secure nonetheless. So he's opening him with an implicit expression of gratitude for all that he had done for him, and a son sitting on the throne, and that's going to shape and influence and affect the thing which he asks him. "And now, O Yahweh, my Elohim, you have appointed your servant to reign instead of my father David. But I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or to come in." He wasn't exactly a little child. He was 19 years old when this event occurred. But he was still young and aware of his inexperience and the awful burden and the monumental task that he had before him. He was the ruler not only of any nation, but the covenant nation, the chosen people of the Almighty Maker, heaven of earth. So this responsibility weighed on him. He had a burden of responsibility that he didn't exactly know how to proceed from, and he brings his self-doubts to Yahweh and asks him to fill the deficiency so that he may rule righteously in his name and for his people. "And your servant in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted." This is reflective of the Yahweh's promise to Abram and Abraham that whether he looked in the sky above, he would see all the stars, and that would be the number of descendants he had, or also on the sand of the seashore. So whether he looked above or below him, he would have a constant reminder of the promise of these great numerous descendants and this prominent nation of people who, they could be counted. I think David issued a census in the 23rd chapter of 2 Samuel, but it was ultimately rejected, and it is in fact identified as a sin because he put his place in numbers, and it was a deviation from his perfect and uncompromised faith in Yahweh. "Shall you then give to your servant an understanding heart to rule your people, to discern between good and evil? For who is able to rule this great people of yours? Certainly not him by inference. He's mindful that he has no great experience or qualifications, at least in himself or his natural capacities or abilities, but he is going to be supernaturally endowed with the wisdom that he asked for. He asked for an understanding heart in order to rule his people. Understanding is necessary to administer justice and to oversee equity throughout one's kingdom and to discern between good and evil. Now, we witness this later in the chapter, the portion we won't be covering today, when his reputation for wisdom spreads, when he makes this very, very wise judgment when two prostitutes are contending for the life of a single child, and one of the prostitutes had, I believe, crushed her son, and so she took the other prostitute's son for herself. Solomon says, "Give me a sword, I will slice it in half." The real mother would rather see go to her than to see her child died, whereas the fake mother, the pretender, said, "Go right ahead." That's, so by their answer, he knew which one was the real mother, just like Yahweh knew by Solomon's answer that he was the right king. And the word was good in the eyes of Yahweh, that Solomon had asked this. So his answer was acceptable, and it would be accommodated, because remember, he had asked him a blank slate for anything he wanted, and it is my personal contention that he would not have done so if he had not known the answer in advance. Now, whenever Yahweh asks a question of humanity, it's not as because he is deficient in knowledge. He does it always and only to test us. So Solomon had answered to his satisfaction. It was an acceptable request and prayer, and it would be accommodated, as we read in the 11th verse. So Elohim said to him, "Because you have asked this, and not have asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice." So these three hypothetical or possible or even highly plausible, given human nature, requests. Now, if we were in his position or even in our own, we would ask for, untold wealth and life, and also the elimination of our enemies. But because these were not his primary priorities, he would be granted them nonetheless. He would be given unprecedented wealth and unprecedented wisdom, as well as be security from his enemy. But the long life was conditional that he remained obedient on the straight and narrow path that his father had modeled and exemplified for him to follow, and by connection for us. "See, I shall do according to your words. See, I shall give you a wise and understanding heart, so that there was none like you before you, and none like you shall arise after you." So the wisdom he's going to bestow upon him and endow him with is going to be something unprecedented and unduplicated. It was something that had never been seen before and would never be seen again, at least until the birth of the Messiah, who was, technically speaking, the wisest man who ever lived. He was fully human, but he was also fully divine, whereas Solomon's wisdom was divinely indwelled, but it did not come from any divine element within him, because he was 100% human. But just to put it in its context, wisdom would have been a highly treasured commodity in the ancient Orient, and it would have been necessary for kings to rule, and all these civilizations of the ancient Near East had their own wisdom traditions, and Solomon, any ruler, would have relied on the advice of so-called wise men, but Solomon didn't ask to be surrounded by wise advisors. He asked for the wisdom himself, so that is significant. He didn't want to leave the job to others that he could do himself, so he shows the right, responsible answer in this request. "And I shall give you what you have not asked, both riches and esteem, so that there may not be any one like you among the kings all your days." So he's going to be head and shoulders above all the rest, and by measure of wealth, by measure of prestige, by measure of influence. His reign witnessed the apex of the United Kingdom of Israel's international influence, and its power and prestige would never be seen anywhere else again, at least among them. and he would be head and shoulders above his rival kings, or he was in the peace building process. He did not consider a lot of these surrounding nations as rivals but allies, and his name Solomon derives from the Hebrew word shalom, which translates as peace, but the English word peace is not nearly adequate enough, I feel, to convey the state of it really indicates a state of spiritual prosperity that is beyond the world's capacity to produce. So when we think of peace, we think of the absence of conflict. That's a part of shalom, but it goes above and beyond it by giving those who possess it with the spiritual security and prosperity. And if you walk in my ways to keep my laws and my commands as your father David walked, then I shall prolong your life. So what's different here and what's distinct and noticeable is that the former promises, the wealth, the wisdom, the prestige, are unconditional. He doesn't have to do anything. He asked for the wisdom, and he didn't ask for the wealth and the prestige. And so all three would be given to him. But he's still liable to the law. The Israelite king, as much as the commoner, was bound to the Mosaic law, and it was especially incumbent on the leader, the king, who set the moral model and example for his subject people to walk in the laws and commands. And Solomon did have a great life, a prolific life, but a good start does not automatically entail a good ending. We read almost the sudden and inexplicable of his demise and his succumbing to idolatry. He overextended his marriages. He married some 300 or 700 royal princesses, and he loved them, and he allowed them to set up their idols. Whereas Pharaoh, as we already mentioned, the Pharaoh's daughter, he gave a palace for herself, but he allowed these other queens to kind of set up shop in his palace and construct their idolatrous edifices. He bowed down to them because he loved them. So it did not, but this moment marks the beginning of what would be close to 40 years of obedience and a life worthy of all emulation. And the 15th and final verse we'll be covering today. And Solomon awoke, and see, it was a dream. And he came into Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, and offered up burnt offerings, and made a peace offering. And he made a feast for all his servants. So upon awaking, the first thing he does when awaking is the last thing he did before he fell asleep. He responds in obedience and offers sacrifices. And the way this is structured, verses 4 through 15 are arranged in the Hebrew literary poetry device known as a chiasm. So what it does is it takes Hebrew poetry is not measured by rhyme, but parallel of concept. So in the fourth verse, we read that he offered 1,000 burnt offerings, and then we read him in the 15th verse offering sacrifices once again. That is A's connection to A. Then in B, we read of verses 6 through 10, we read of Solomon's request, and then we read the other connection of B is verses 11 through 14, which are Yahweh's answer. So they all connect. They do have it would probably make more sense if I could write this out and show you a visible thing, but I only have limited resources. But in any case, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.